Emergency Economic Powers Act. Passing this resolution just became even more urgent because of the President's announcement of even more across-the-board tariffs this afternoon, including a minimum 10% tax on all imports and even higher tariffs on certain countries, including our friends and allies. This is a country that has thrived on the fact, and our economy has grown because we do business with the world. And already with the President's announcement, which he calls Liberation Day, I call it a national sales tax day, because the estimates are that these tariffs will result in about $5,000 in taxes, that's right, on the average family in America every single year. What has happened? Well, the stock market's closed, but the futures are tanking. They are tanking. And that is because people get that this is not going to work for our American economy. They don't want a national sales tax. People involved in the economy of this country, everyone from small business owners on, and they're going to be the first hit by this because they do not actually have the wherewithal and the big conglomeration to try to deal with it. Small farmers in my state that are already dealing with retaliatory tariffs, that are already dealing with the fact that Canadians who used to buy their stuff don't want to buy it anymore, or other countries aren't buying their stuff. And what happens then? The Canadians look for other markets, and there's other countries, other manufacturers, other farmers, and other nations that say, we are more than happy to fill your contract, sir. We are more than happy to help you out with that aluminum, ma'am, because of these tariffs. Tourism from Canada right now, the numbers just came out, down 75%. That is hotels, that is restaurants. You think they don't know what's going on in Canada? They're looking at every single move. First they were shocked, and now they're pissed. And that is exactly what's happening right now. This resolution is about drawing a line in the sand and saying, you cannot abuse your emergency powers to start an unjustified trade war. You cannot abuse your emergency powers to hurt one of the finest relationships in the world, the relationship between America and Canada. And you cannot drive up prices, eliminate jobs, and put in place a national sales tax. Canada is not just our neighbor. With my state, it's our #1 trading partner. In fact, we do so much business with Canada that it is more than the total of our #2, #3, and #4 largest markets combined. We are the 4th biggest ag exporter, the state of Minnesota, in the country. So we know a little bit about how this works. In 2023 alone, our state exported $7 billion in goods to Canada, including ag products, machinery, and medical devices. That's a major hit for the retaliatory tariffs that we're going to see. The damage could extend to every sector of our economy. I just mentioned tourism. So I chair the Canadian-American Interparliamentarian Group. I go to Canada a lot. I know our partners over there. I know the people in the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, all of them. And the one thing that has united us to a T is this friendship that has far transcended this president. I remember it was the Canadian Embassy in one of the worst of times for our country that had banners draped in the front of their embassy that said, friends, neighbors, partners, allies. Those banners aren't hanging there right now, and they're not going to put them up anytime soon. It was the Canadians that were the first to arrive after 9/11 to volunteer to help out our country in its greatest moment of need. They fought alongside us in 2 world wars. This is a long-standing friendship and an incredible trade relationship based on mutual respect and trust, and yes, 2 strong economies. Because these new tariffs are already causing harm, as I noted, they amount to a national sales tax. Since the administration began to propose and implement or pause but hang over people's head wide-ranging tariff, wholesale prices have gone up on everything from meat and coffee to natural gas and lumber. Homeowners Association, Home Builders Association, Retail Association. How many business groups? Are the Republicans not listening to them anymore? And add to that the steel workers. Do they not care about that? They're opposed to that, and they support this resolution that Senator Kaine and Warner and I have come together to introduce. With these tariffs across the world, we're going to see a $20,000 increase to the price of a home and a $3,000 increase to an American-made car. This might not mean much to Elon Musk and the billionaires in Trump's cabinet, but it means a lot to the people in my state. Tariffs can be an important tool. Sure, you can have targeted tariffs. That's not what this is. These tariffs on Canada are an abuse of the emergency powers. And if they want to negotiate this, put it in the upcoming negotiations of the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement that I supported, that President Trump negotiated in his last administration. Why wouldn't he do it there? Why instead is he doing his usual shock and awe, jarring the economy? This is going to be a blanket permission slip for tariff wars. And I will note again, thank Senator Kaine, our bipartisan group of supporters, and the United Steelworkers, International Association of Machinists, North American Building Trades Union, AFL-CIO, Chamber of Commerce, National Taxpayers Union, and the National Retail Federation have all endorsed this resolution. Maybe we don't care about all those businesses and all those workers, but maybe we should listen to them. This resolution is about restoring common sense and responsible governance. It is about Congress reasserting its constitutional role on trade, and it's about standing up for American workers, businesses, and consumers who are being asked to pay the price of this trade war. Let's change course before the damage becomes even more permanent. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. Thank you.
President.
Gentleman from Vermont.
I fully support the resolution of Senator Kaine. And I want to make 3 points. Number one, should Congress continue to abdicate its constitutional responsibility, ceding it to the executive? Number two, I want to talk about the total fantasy world that the Trump economic agenda is grounded in, if you can use the word grounded. And then third, I want to talk about how these tariffs will be a dagger in the heart of the Vermont economy. Now, first of all, the question for this institution is, will we, as the United States Senate, accept the responsibility that each and every one of us as senators has to stand up for the independent authority and responsibility of this institution? And as we know, our Constitution was based on the proposition of real suspicion of the accumulation of power in any one entity. And what was told to us in the Federalist Papers is what we know. If you have the concentration of power in any institution, that concentration of power leads inevitably to the abuse of power. And the design of our Constitution was to have equal and independent branches. And what I'm seeing is a lawless rampage on the part of the executive being accommodated by an appeasing Congress, not standing up for its authority in many different areas, and then also an attack on the judiciary as though the judges who disagree with an executive position should be impeached. But our authority over the budget is being advocated, as we saw in the CR. But another area of authority for the Congress is the tariff authority. And a couple of decades ago, this Congress gave and delegated some authority to the president in a national emergency to impose tariffs. That national emergency was given, that authority was given with the expectation, and rightly so in a mutually respectful civil society, that a president would use it for the intended purpose and with restraint, whether it was Republican or Democrat. And the national security had the connotation and implication of a military threat to our country, where there needed to be immediate executive action to protect the citizens of this country. What President Trump has done is run roughshod over that, showing no restraint and using that delegation of authority, not for a national emergency, but for whatever his latest policy idea is and whatever leverage he wants to extract. We cannot allow that to happen and maintain the separation of powers that is absolutely so fundamental to the long-term well-being of our country. So Senator Kaine is absolutely right. This is not a partisan question. It's an institutional question. Do we see our role? Do we see our responsibility for maintaining that system of checks and balances? I do. That's the heart of this matter, and it is as important as even the outcome of what this tariff policy may be. Second, where does this tariff policy come from? It comes from the president, who's claiming that it'll be a new golden age if we impose these tariffs. And by the way, these are astonishing tariffs, okay? South Korea, 25%, Vietnam, 46%, Taiwan, 32%, Switzerland, 31%, Malaysia, 24%, Cambodia, 49%. Do we realistically think there'll be no retaliation against America for these tariffs? We know there will be. Yet, what the president seems to think, and this literally is a fantasy, that the golden age of America was when we had the tariff policy that he says caused the Great Depression, but where all economic historians, what all economic historians say caused the Depression, he says that if we had had tariff policy then, we wouldn't have had the Depression. There is literally no support for this. So the president has come up with this fiction, and what he's good at is sales. He says it over and over again. He cloaks it in an appealing objective. We want to have jobs back in America, and that is certainly something all of us share. But this fantasy that he has, and it is a fantasy, that high tariffs are going to, quote, make us rich and be paid for by other countries instead of our consumers. Just ask anybody who goes to Target or Walmart how that's going to work out for them. Ask anybody who's going to be wanting to build a house or buy a house where the prices are going to go up probably $25,000 in Vermont for a house. The third thing I want to talk about is very concretely in Vermont. This is devastating for us in Vermont. You know, our farmers get most of their fertilizer from Canada, 25% increase. And our farmers are on the margin. They are operating on such a thin margin that a 25% increase raises the existential question of whether they stay in business. Our maple sugar producers, they get their equipment largely from Canada. 25% increase in the expense of buying an evaporator. Vermont consumers and businesses, we in Vermont along the northern border, I see my colleague from New Hampshire, same for you. We get so much of our home heating fuel, so much of our gasoline to power our cars, and so much of our electricity from Canada that at the end of that month, when you're juggling your checkbook and trying to make it balance, you're going to have a higher electricity bill. You're going to have a higher home heating bill. And every time you fill up, you're going to pay between 25 cents and 40 cents more a gallon, because on northern Vermont, that's where our gasoline comes from. How is that going to serve anybody's interest? How is that going to help the people who are working hard every day to try to make ends meet? It is going to be devastating for them. And in addition to that, all of the uncertainty, you know, we have a responsibility to make, through policy, the lives of our folks in business, the lives of our farmers, the lives of our moms and dads easier, not harder. In this uncertainty that is the hallmark of the Trump approach, and these higher costs that are absolutely legislated as a result of his policy or by executive order, that's going to make life harder for all of the people that I represent in Vermont. You know, I want to, instead of just using my words, I want to use the words of a lot of Vermonters. When we got word, Mr. President, of these tariffs going into effect, we had a couple of roundtables up in northern Vermont, St. Albans and in Newport. And obviously, I wanted to hear from Vermonters. And here's how they say it. And by the way, this is not a partisan deal at all. This is somebody who's trying to run a business. It's somebody who's trying to pay their bills and their family. It's a construction company. But a vegetable farmer, Stoney Thompson, it feels like death by 1,000 cuts. Vermont Food Bank, Jason Maring, we get some of our vegetables from the Quebec side of the border. If the 25% tariff was applied in full, it'll be about $130,000 to $150,000 unbudgeted hit to our food procurement efforts. Catherine Durand of Agrimark, the ripple effects that this could have on energy markets and, of course, manufacturing is very heavy. Matt Cook from PC Construction, I'm just concerned in general that it's going to further stagnate the ability for some of these much-needed construction projects to move forward. Dennis Borbo, Borbo Custom Homes, they build about 3 or 4 homes a year. Good business in northern Vermont. We would be strongly affected by the tariffs in terms of equipment costs for U.S. producers. I'm very concerned with the possible effects of this. Another, I can foresee the making homes unaffordable, which they already are. You know, just another vivid example of that, some of the hardest working people we have in Vermont are our loggers. And they harvest logs, ship them up to Canada. And they will be paying a tariff when that log goes up to Canada. When it's milled and returned as lumber that can be used in home building, there'll be a 25% tariff on that as that lumber returns. Who's going to pay for that? The home builder or the home buyer. That's what's going to happen. So how in the world is this going to lead to the so-called golden age? The golden age is as much a fantasy as is the fantasy that tariffs were the visionary economic policy that will bring us to the promised land. These tariffs, number one, are the authority of Congress if we exercise our authority. They are not the authority of the executive. And Congress should stand up for itself and assert its authority and protect the constitutional promise of separation of powers, because we know that the concentration of power leads to the abuse of power. And by the way, that's exactly what's happening right now. And secondly, let's not be deluded by a fantasy economic theory that is at the core of this. It just makes no sense. It has no credibility. It has no intellectual foundation. Who knows how President Trump came to believe in this so much that he asserts it. But third, if we look at what's the impact on the people we represent, the people who build homes, the people who farm our fields, the people who tap maple syrup, the people who run health clinics, the people who run food banks, and we ask them, hey, how is this going to affect you? Will it help? Will it hurt? And when every single one of those people we represent who are doing the hard work day in and day out say, Peter, this is a disaster and we're going to vote for it? No way. Thank you, Senator Kaine. Mr. President, I yield.
I recognize the senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. I came to the floor to join my colleagues because I am so concerned about the damaging impact of President Trump's tariff taxes, and I call them taxes because that's what they really are. But those tariffs, particularly on Canada, although we heard today that he's announced a number of others. On Monday, I've been hearing from a lot of small businesses in New Hampshire, but on Monday I visited a bakery in Derry, New Hampshire, that may have to go out of business due to what President Trump is proposing on tariffs on Canada. Now, the owner of Shatila's Bakery moved to the United States 36 years ago. He's a cardiologist, and with his brother, a PhD scientist, they were from Lebanon. He became a citizen, he raised his family, sent his daughter to college, and he and his brother got interested in sugar-free desserts and candies because their mother was diabetic. So he spent the last 36 years building his business, and now he might have to sell his factory because of the trade war that President Trump has started with Canada. Shatila's Bakery makes sugar-free desserts. They get some of their ingredients from Canada. All of those ingredients are now more expensive, and while I was there, he showed me a fuel bill he had just gotten that said that because of the tariffs, his fuel bill was going up. But more important than that, 85% of his business comes from exporting to Canadian customers. Most of his sales contracts in Canada were canceled after these tariffs went into effect last month. So he says he's going to lose between $400,000 and $500,000 this year in the business. Now, President Trump says he's worried about trade imbalances and that he wants to support exporters. Well, here's an American small business and an exporter. And because of what this president is doing with his reckless trade war, this small business owner might go out of business. So Mr. Shatila said to me, and I quote, "When I came, this was the American dream, which is why we built it. But now you see it in front of your eyes. It's just melted like ice." And I asked him what he would like to ask President Trump if he had the opportunity. And he said, his question was to the president, "What do you want me to do? If you really care about your country, why don't you support small businesses, which are the backbone of every community?" I think that said it about as well as anybody I've heard. And we know, sadly, that his business is not the only one. Many of our small businesses in New Hampshire are reliant on travel and tourism. I've heard from businesses across our state about Canadian tourists canceling plans already, about bookings that they rely on that are not going to come through. Last week, we saw that airline tickets for travelers coming from Canada this summer are down more than 70% from this time last year. That represents lost business for my constituents and for businesses and communities across this country. All of this will put their businesses at risk, and it will do so when they are also facing higher costs for inputs because of these tariff taxes. 2 weeks ago, I visited a bus company, runs bus lines between the seacoast of New Hampshire and Boston and New York. They're facing $500,000 in added costs because of these tariffs. And now on top of that, he stands to lose business because fewer people are visiting the United States. He also goes between the seacoast and Logan Airport. All of that because the president has damaged the relationship we have with one of our closest allies. It doesn't make sense to me. What is the logic of antagonizing those allies and partners that we rely on? And lest anyone forget, the president is claiming that the flow of fentanyl from Canada justifies all this. Well, fentanyl and other drugs are serious issues, and I've spent much of my time in the Senate doing what I can to help stop those drugs from entering the United States and to getting help for those who need it. Just last month, the Senate passed the HALT Fentanyl Act, which is legislation that I co-sponsored along with a lot of my colleagues, which would permanently schedule fentanyl-related substances. Imposing tariffs against Canada is not the way to fight fentanyl and other drugs. This kind of legislation, like the HALT Fentanyl Act, is something that is going to have much more of an impact. CBP statistics show that all the fentanyl seized along the northern border from the beginning of 2022 until now is 71 pounds. Now, that's a lot of fentanyl, and that could kill a lot of people. So I don't endorse that by any means. But you compare that with the 67,966 pounds that have been seized along the U.S.-Mexico border for the same period of time. Wouldn't it make more sense to focus on where most of this fentanyl is coming from? Instead of imposing tariffs, we should be working cooperatively with our allies and partners. And Canada has taken a number of steps to crack down and to stop drugs from coming into the United States. The tariffs that are in place before today are likely to raise costs by nearly $2,000 for the average household. That's money many families in New Hampshire and across this country can't afford to pay when they're trying to cover the cost of groceries, of housing, of childcare, of energy, all of those things that President Trump, when he was running for president, said he was going to address. I've heard from many New Hampshire families about how these tariffs will raise prices for keeping their homes warm, for putting gas in their cars. And now the Trump administration has reportedly fired the entire staff of the LIHEAP program that helps families and seniors heat their homes when they can't afford to pay. The message to the American people from this administration is increasingly clear. They do not care about you and what your needs are. So, voting for Senator Kane's resolution presents an opportunity for Congress to help Americans who are worried about higher costs. I intend to vote for this resolution to end the tariffs on Canada, to lower costs for Americans, and to help our small businesses. And I hope all my colleagues will do the same. Now, I just want to add that in the last hour, President Trump announced a new tax of 10% on everything Americans import, with far higher taxes on many countries. Everything from the EU will now face a 20% tax, Japan and South Korea 25%. I mean, again, the rationale for why we are going after our allies and partners makes no sense. And this is a tremendous tax increase on American business and families, likely the largest peacetime tax increase in U.S. history. This new Trump tariff tax will add at least another $3,000 to the costs of for an average household. And again, this president promised he was going to lower costs for families. This does nothing to do that. He is taxing all of the goods that people buy every day. And what he doesn't tell you is that the reason he's doing this is so that he can give more money to provide tax cuts for the top 1% of the income earners in the country, so the billionaires. I don't think this tax increase is going to help the small business owner I visited on Monday, or the families in my state and across this country who are trying to afford groceries. And I intend to vote to end those tariffs on Canada today when I have the opportunity. I hope my colleagues will join me. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm rise to join with my colleagues who are in support of Senator Kane's, I think, thoughtful approach on how we put an end to this tariff war with Canada. And I got to tell you, one of the things about working with Tim Kaine for 40 years is he always keeps a hugely optimistic view of things. And boy, do I need a dose of Tim Kaine optimism today. Because we've seen in our national security domain reckless disregard for classified information, and no one so far held accountable. And the message that sends to our allies, to the men and women who work in our military or intelligence, because if they did the same behavior that the so-called Signal Gate, they'd be fired. Or need to Tim Kaine optimism today because the long-awaited Republican budget resolution adds $6 trillion to the deficit. $4 trillion in funny math, and about another $2 trillion for tax cuts. So that then brings us to not my words, but Peter Navarro's words, who I happen to be with on a Sunday, says these group of tariffs will add $6 trillion in revenues. Who do you think is going to pay for that? Candidly, it's going to be the people who buy the presiding officer's cars in his great dealerships in Ohio. It's going to be folks in Virginia. We had one of our brewers in yesterday who's already laid off 20% of his staff because he imports malted Pilsner from Canada. What we're seeing with Trump is not America first, but what's going to be is America alone. And I say to anybody I spend way too much time in a skiff, I know, but America alone is not an America that's safer. And the notional idea that we've picked on our longest, best friend in many ways. I'm a little biased. My mom's parents were from Canada. But the notion that this president is trying to turn Canada into an enemy is beyond belief. You know, I talked to a senior Canadian leader just the other day. He said, Mark, you know, even if tomorrow Trump says, never mind, as he's gone back and forth a dozen times, say no harm, no foul, the damage we have done to the relationship between America and Canada will take years to recover. Senator Sheen just mentioned airplane flights down 75%. Americans' national anthem booed at hockey games. We had another person in who ships whiskey, Virginia bourbon, up to Canada. All the tariffs are off tomorrow, which they're not. It will be years, if ever, that Canadians will be buying American bourbon again. So, in dreamland, $6 trillion of tariffs, you know, it's the largest tax increase in American history. I believe it actually goes beyond World War I. And the so-called Liberation Day, the only thing that is liberating is this administration's liberating Americans from their savings because the market's down. They're liberating businesses from their supply chains because of so much disruption. And they're liberating consumers from their hard-earned money because this is going to translate into increased costs. This isn't partisan. This isn't Democrat, Republican. This is math. And no matter how much the president wants to strut on the South Lawn, and glad to see at least the South Lawn was being used for an announcement today as opposed to another day of a Tesla show lot, who's going to bear the brunt of this? It's going to be Americans. It's going to be Canadians. It's going to be people around the world. I'm sure my friend has already mentioned this, particularly from Virginia's standpoint. Canada is our second biggest trading partner, Virginia. Virginia businesses export approximately $3.3 billion worth of products to Canada. We import about $3.2 billion. Virginia farmers sell about $430 million of goods to Canada. A lot of Virginia peanuts go to Canada. They're not going to be going. That is going to hurt our economy. Matter of fact, in Virginia, 280,000 jobs in Virginia depend on trade and investment with Canada. I know as governor, I went. I know Senator Kaine, as governor, you went because Canada's one of our best partners. What would the reception be tomorrow if we showed up in Ottawa? This is not going to be just another economic policy. This is at the lifeblood of the Canadian economy, and combined with the so-called reciprocal tariffs around the world, it is the lifeblood of the American economy. So I know Senator Van Hollen's going to say a lot of the same things that I was going to say. I would just say to the presiding officer again, I know you sell great cars, but I'm not sure even folks in Ohio are going to be able to afford $2,000 or $5,000 more per car just because of ill-suited tariffs. So I hope that folks on both sides of the aisle will actually stand up for America first. Reject this misguided tariff strategy. Reject this demonization of Canada. Recognize that America first doesn't have to be America alone. The only thing that could make my day actually better at this point, beyond that little dose of Kaine optimism, if the Senate finally comes to its senses tonight, endorses Tim's resolution, and we put an end to this misguided economic policy. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to start by thanking our colleagues from Virginia, starting with Senator Kaine, who brought us to this debate here on the Senate floor today on a very important question. And to my other colleague from across the Potomac River from Maryland, Senator Warner. And we sometimes disagree on various issues. On this, we have solidarity across the Potomac River. And that unity comes from a very simple result, which is we are here to sound the alarm about the trade war that Donald Trump just unleashed today. He calls it Liberation Day. If he had made this announcement yesterday on April Fool's Day, people would have thought it was an April Fool's joke. But this is no joke, and it's not Liberation Day. It is a national sales tax day, because that will be the result of the president's action. A sales tax on the American people, a national sales tax. Because today the president announced he was levying massive across-the-board tariffs on countless goods, making big promises, but at the end of the day betraying the American people, who are going to be hit hard by rising prices. And you know, we've heard the president make a lot of promises about what these tariffs will do. It's like a miracle cure. They're going to revive American manufacturing. They're going to stop fentanyl. They're going to balance our budget. They're going to make all of us rich, and all those other countries are going to pay for it. Problem is, none of that is true. Other countries don't pay these tariffs. We do. It is a sales tax on goods imported from other countries. American importers pay the tax at the border, and they pass the costs on to the consumers. What else are they supposed to do? And American manufacturers that put together products here in the United States but import some of the parts they use in those products will face higher costs, higher prices on the parts that they import. And they're going to have to pass on those costs to American consumers, so they're going to have to jack up their prices. When they jack up their prices, not only do American consumers pay more, but those American manufacturers and American producers, when they're exporting goods overseas, they're having to export at higher prices, and that makes their products less competitive overseas. And on top of that, it's a double whammy, because when you have these big tariff increases on products from other countries aren't just going to sit back and take it. They're going to respond. They're going to retaliate. They're going to put tariffs on American products that we export to their countries. And what will happen then? That means that an American producer exporting products overseas, whether manufactured products or agriculture products, their products are going to face higher prices in those countries. And they will be less competitive, and people in those countries will buy less of those American products. So that means here at home, they'll have to lay off workers. It's going to hurt the economy back home in both those ways. You know, we saw a little mini version of this during the first Trump administration. Back then, Donald Trump raised tariffs on Chinese products, and China responded with retaliatory tariffs on many American farm exports like wheat and soybeans and pork. What happened? Well, American farmers sold less of those products overseas. They got more expensive. And you know how we know this was all a big fake out? Was when American farmers were not able to sell their products into China's market because of China's retaliatory tariffs, we bailed them out. We, the American taxpayer, we spent $23 billion in taxpayer money from the American people to pay American farmers not to be more productive. They were productive. But because China raised tariffs on their products in retaliation for Donald Trump raising tariffs on theirs. Now look, we all recognize that tariffs can be an effective tool when they're used in a targeted way with strategic industries. But that's not what Donald Trump is doing. This is not strategic. He is starting an all-out trade war and apparently does not care about the consequences. It is leading already to chaos in the markets. I'm not going to go through all those because Senator Warner and Senator Kaine and others have spoken to that. But at the end of the day, the direction we're heading could well take us into a recession. As Senator Warner mentioned, some of the president's people have said this is going to be $6 trillion worth of tariffs over the next 10 years, by far the largest effective tax hike in American history. Economists estimate that it will cost the typical American household up to $4,200 more per year. That's a whopping sales tax. The National Association of Home Builders says that tariffs will make new homes cost up to $10,000 more at a time when we're already facing an affordable housing crisis. The North America's building trade unions sent a letter opposing these tariffs, saying, and I quote, "We are seeing construction projects slowing down, infrastructure investments being delayed, and economic momentum weakening, resulting in smaller paychecks, fewer jobs, and shrinking opportunities for skilled building trades and workers," unquote. A researcher at Cornell University says a new car could cost up to $20,000 more because of all the back and forth across borders and all the additional tariffs that apply each time a border is crossed. U.S.-made cars are estimated to increase by at least $3,000, or up to $3,000. So buying a house, buying a car, these are all things that families save towards. So what this comes down to is a tax on the American dream. And these increased costs may not mean a lot to the billionaires in the president's cabinet. After all, we had Secretary of Commerce say recently with respect to Social Security benefits that, hey, if Americans didn't get their Social Security benefits one week, nobody would notice except the fraudsters. That's the kind of attitude we have from this administration when it comes to increasing prices that we will all experience as a result of these tariffs. They think people won't notice, but they will. Finally, Mr. President, I do want to talk to the other part of this issue. And I'm not going to belabor the point because others have spoken to it eloquently, especially the chief sponsor of this effort, Senator Kaine, which is that President Trump is he's abusing the International Economic Emergency Powers Act to apply these tariffs to Canada. That's a law aimed at protecting our national security. It's a law that we have used against adversaries like Iran, Sudan, North Korea, Russia. But here, President Trump is using it to target our longtime friend, our longtime ally, Canada. He's declared a phony emergency on our northern border to target our friends there. Now, he claims that these punitive tariffs will somehow address the fentanyl crisis. And of course, we should be addressing the fentanyl crisis in the United States of America, and this Congress has done a lot and needs to do a lot more. But in the fight against fentanyl, Canadian people are, number one, they're our allies, and number two, they're not the ones that are causing the problem. 0.2% of fentanyl trafficked in the United States comes across the U.S.-Canadian border, and Canada is right now putting together a $1.3 billion plan to strengthen that border security and stop it altogether. So this is a fake emergency declared by the president, putting on these massive tariffs, and I'll close with why. And we're going to find out more about this in the next couple days. I heard the chairman of the Finance Committee speaking a little bit earlier about how the proceeds from collecting tariffs might be counted and used to offset tax cuts, which are going to be aimed at the very, very wealthy in this country. Tax relief for the wealthy, paid for in part by a national sales tax on all the other Americans in the country. Paid for, as we've heard, by going after Medicaid. So whether it's a national sales tax or other efforts aimed at the American people that will hurt the American people and hit them in the pocketbooks, that's all done in service to pay for tax cuts for the very wealthy, people like Elon Musk. So I want to say thank you to the senator from Virginia, Senator Kaine, for blowing the whistle on this phony action taken at our friend Canada, all as a pretext to increase tariffs, which amount to a huge sales tax on the American people in service of a tax cut for the very wealthy. I thank my colleagues.
Mr. President,
I recognize the senator from Connecticut.
I'm honored to follow my colleague from Maryland who has described so well the reasons that we should oppose these tariffs, and thank my colleague from Virginia, Senator Kaine, who has demonstrated once again the leadership that makes him such a great member of this body. I want to begin, and I hope the presiding officer will forgive me, with a four-letter word. It's a word that I said to my children they should never use. Dumb. Dumb. D-U-M-B. These tariffs are dumb. They are also cruel, and they are stupid. They are imposed in the name of perhaps building manufacturing in this country, which they won't do, or in the name of raising revenue to cut taxes for the wealthy, which is adding insult to injury, or simply for vengeance. So much of what this administration does is for the purpose of vengeance and vanity. Careless, cruel, reckless. That's what these tariffs are, particularly as directed to Canada. Let's be clear. the tariffs proposed by President Trump are a tax. They are a tax. There's no tariff ever imposed in the history of the United States of America that has ever lowered prices. These tariffs will raise prices, and they threaten not only higher costs for everything from gas to groceries to rental housing, but they also deeply threaten a recession. I've been reading a book called Freedom from Fear, written by a great historian, a professor at Yale named David Kennedy. Freedom from Fear is about the events and the misdirection and mistakes that led our nation to the Great Depression. What began as a recession, what started as a Wall Street problem, became a global depression because the world failed to realize that even then our economies were connected and that tariffs could hurt all countries when all countries adopted them, when a trade war ensued, and a trade war now is what we face. Canada has long been one of our nation's closest allies and trading partners. We have a bond with Canada that goes beyond simple economics. Although, frankly, our relationship with Canada supports millions of jobs, protects the competitiveness of American businesses, and ensures our long-term economic prosperity. Our countries have countless trade and investment agreements, cross-border projects, such as communications, highways, bridges, pipelines, that have resulted in integrated networks and transportation systems. We have a long-standing defense and security partnership, providing us with greater security than we could have alone. And we share a border. But the border is a symbol of a bond that our peoples have in common. A friendship that goes deep, a heritage and a culture that we respect. These bonds will be betrayed by a reckless trade policy the administration is pursuing and threatens to derail that valuable, in fact, precious partnership. These tariffs are going to hurt all Americans. We have, with Canada, one of the most comprehensive and important trading relationships. I go into the numbers. In 2024, Canada was the United States' second largest trading partner with $761.2 billion in total trade, largest single U.S. export markets for goods. Every day, nearly 500,000 people and billions of dollars in goods and services cross that border. But I want to focus on Connecticut for the moment, because Connecticut demonstrates what will happen to America as a whole, and I represent the people of Connecticut, and this regimen of tariffs will be catastrophic for Connecticut. Friends in Connecticut, listen to what these haphazard tariffs will do. Canada is Connecticut's single largest trading partner, accounting for 20% of our total trade in 2024, including 13% of our imports and 13% of our exports and 25% of our imports. Consumers in Connecticut already face some of the highest electricity prices in the nation, with an average cost of 28.16 cents per kilowatt hour compared to the national average of 16.26 cents per kilowatt hour. Connecticut and New York as a whole get a significant share of our electricity from cheaper Eastern Canadian hydropower. The 10% tariffs proposed on energy resources from Canada will directly impact and drastically increase those electricity costs. ISO New England has estimated that this tax would add $66 million in annual consumer costs. I hope President Trump will listen to the people of Connecticut and New England when it comes to electricity costs. Do not impose these tariffs. And the harm to Connecticut is far from limited to just energy prices. Some of the largest state industries, including aerospace, defense, advanced manufacturing, medical devices, all rely on trade with Canada to remain profitable. These industries source key production imports from Canada, including aerospace parts, critical minerals and metals, basic chemicals and petroleum and coal products, and in return we export billions of dollars of goods to Canada. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people across Connecticut, jobs, employment, all stand to see their livelihoods threatened if this tax is allowed. And it will ripple across Connecticut. It will reverberate through the country, to the presiding officer state, to Virginia, New York, Maryland, colleagues on both sides of the aisle. The cost of living in Connecticut will rise drastically. We already have one of the highest costs of living in the country. Taxing these goods will put an undue financial strain on individuals and families across Connecticut, but most important, on people who can least afford a higher tax. Our middle income and lower income members of the workforce, working people in Connecticut who have to buy stuff depending on their paychecks, for groceries, for gasoline. A tax on those products will hit them in the pocketbook. It will hit their families. It will hit them at the kitchen table when they go to the drugstore to buy pharmaceuticals, when they have down payments on homes, on furnishings, across the board. So I am not here to make a speech. I'm really here to make a plea. Mr. President, please reconsider. These tariffs are fundamentally misguided. They are dumb. They are cruel, reckless, and careless. They play fast and loose with America's credibility around the world. And I urge my colleagues to vote yes on Senate Joint Resolution 37 and join us in trying to save the American economy and our credibility around the world. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
I recognize the Democrat leader.
Thank you, and thank my friend from Connecticut for his excellent words. Much of what he said could be applied to New York. I want to thank Senator Kaine for his seeing around the curve, seeing how important this was months ago, and persisting and persisting and persisting in getting us to this place. Now, Mr. President, President Trump just announced his new tariff package a few hours ago, and it's even worse than we thought. In addition to the tariffs that he has already imposed, he now has a 10% across-the-board tariff on all products. What is this going to do to American families? It's going to clobber them. It's estimated that the Trump tariff will add about $5,000 to the average family's cost. And why is he doing it? To reduce taxes on the billionaires. They've said that. Navarro and he have said it over and over again that they want to reduce those taxes. It is outrageous. It is outrageous. The average family sitting at the kitchen table on Friday night is saying to themselves, whoa, boy, we better cut back on our purchases. Maybe we ought not go out to the restaurant. Maybe we ought not to take that vacation we've been saving up for a year. Maybe we ought not to buy that new car. Consumer confidence is lower than it's been in many, many years. The average business because of the chaotic nature, Trump says one thing one day and another thing the next day, are holding back. Businesses, small and large, need certainty. But there's no certainty here with the chaos that Donald Trump has created. And listen to this. When told that it would raise the costs on the American family, Trump himself said he couldn't care less if prices go up. What kind of bubble is he living in? These billionaires who are running the country, Trump, Musk, Lutnick, they're in such a bubble they don't know how the average family is hurting. Yeah, they're billionaires. God bless them. They made a lot of money. But don't think that average people are in the same boat. The costs of groceries, the costs of prescription drugs, the cost of gasoline, the costs of buying a car, the costs of buying a house, the costs of furniture, the costs of clothing, everything people buy is going to go up. Donald Trump said he'd reduce prices on day one when he got elected. He's doing just the opposite with these tariffs. He's raising prices through the roof and strangling American families. My colleague in Connecticut alluded to Smoot-Hawley. The new Smoot-Hawley is Trump-Musk. These taxes could create a global trade war. Our allies, previous allies, are allying together how they're going to get back at Trump and what he's done to the country. This is not Liberation Day, as Trump called it. This has made a few weeks earlier, in effect, tax day. Huge taxes through tariffs on American families. It's a gut punch. It's a gut punch for the average American. And so, right now, I know Donald Trump is pressuring Senate Republicans to vote this resolution down. He's treating this like a loyalty test. But my plea to my Senate Republican colleagues, stand with the American people. You know how bad this is. A few of you have already said you can't vote for this. Please, don't be intimidated by Donald Trump, who said he couldn't care less if prices go up on your constituents, my Republican colleagues. Don't listen to him. This is a disaster for working families, a disaster for the nation's economy, a disaster for our alliances and relationships around the world. All doing so much to hurt America for one darn reason: cutting taxes for the billionaires. This is a government by the billionaires. Everything they do, whether it's this budget they came out with today or this tariff bill, is in obeisance to the very few wealthy people who seem to control the Republican Party and want another tax cut. I urge everybody to vote against these horrible, horrible tariffs. Tariffs on Canada have very little to do with fentanyl, we know that. Tariffs on Canada and all the other countries he's now added to the list have everything to do with tax breaks, more tax breaks for billionaires. I strongly, strongly urge a no vote. This bill is worse than what we had thought. He made it worse when he announced what he was doing a few hours ago. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Senator Kaine for his leadership on this issue. President Trump's new tariffs are not Liberation Day, they're Obliteration Day. They are going to be remembered as something that raised taxes on every American consumer, had foreign countries then attack businesses all across our nation, all without a plan from President Trump to have an end game. President Trump is just making this up. And we're going to have to wait to see how he responds when Europe attacks us, when Canada attacks us, when Asian countries now attack us. He's inviting an attack upon the American economy. even as American consumers have to pay higher taxes. So we're at just the dawn of the equivalent of an all-out war, trade war, with every other country in the world. And who's going to pay the price? American workers and American taxpayers. They're the ones who are going to pay the price. So, Mr. President, I rise tonight to speak about the outrageous calls we have been hearing to impeach federal judges who have ruled against Donald Trump. And that's right. Donald Trump and his extremist MAGA supporters think that if a federal judge dares to rule against the president, that judge should be impeached. Recently, Trump tweeted that Judge James Boasberg, the chief judge of the federal district court here in Washington, D.C., should be impeached because he ruled against Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members to El Salvador without any due process. Elon Musk, whose Department of Government Efficiency has been on the losing side of several recent judicial decisions, has referred to federal judges as evil and called for, quote, a wave of judicial impeachments. In the other body, MAGA extremists have taken up the cudgel and filed articles of impeachment against federal judges who have ruled against the president, and then they receive political contributions from Elon Musk for doing so. And just last week, Speaker Johnson even suggested eliminating entire federal courts because their judges have dared to rule against Donald Trump. These calls for the impeachment of judges and elimination of courts are just the latest salvos in a broad attack on the courts, on lawyers, on the rule of law by the president and by his allies. I come to the Senate floor today to condemn this dangerous and un-American onslaught against the judiciary and legal profession and urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to speak out against it. Federal judges confirmed by the Senate and given life terms under the Constitution during good behavior are not like contestants on The Apprentice. You don't get to fire them because you don't like the way they are doing their job. The president and his acolytes don't seem to understand this. With each call to impeach judges, they disregard and disrespect the Constitution, its separation of powers, its checks and balances, and its establishment of three co-equal branches of government, one of which is a judiciary whose principal job, as the Supreme Court explained more than 200 years ago in Marbury versus Madison, is to, quote, say what the law is, to say what is constitutional. And that is precisely what the courts have been doing. Since retaking office, Donald Trump has issued a series of executive orders that are blatantly, patently, and obviously unconstitutional and illegal. Trump's illegal belief that he can supersede the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress with an executive order has spawned more than 100 lawsuits against his administration. And federal judges across the country, judges appointed by Democrat and Republican presidents alike, including Donald Trump himself, are doing the same job that judges have done in our country for centuries. They are interpreting statutes, making legal determinations, and upholding the Constitution of the United States. They are moving swiftly to hear cases and, for now, preventing some of the most egregiously unlawful Trump policies from taking effect. Revoking birthright citizenship? Blocked. Freezing all federal funding? Blocked. Pulling down public health websites? Blocked. Capping funding for critical health research at the National Institutes of Health? Blocked. Denying gender-affirming health care to transgender youth? Blocked. Allowing Musk to unbridled access to Social Security data? Blocked. Clawing back funds appropriated by Congress and obligated to my National Climate Bank? Blocked by a federal district court judge. And the list goes on and on and on and on. Blocked, 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 blocked. In these cases, like any others, if the losing party disagrees with the judge's decision on what the law is, they can appeal it. What they shouldn't do is to call for the extraordinary step of impeaching the presiding judge. That is a remedy the Constitution reserves for only grave ethical or criminal misconduct. And that's why John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States, was compelled to issue a rare public statement after President Trump called for the impeachment of Judge Boasberg. Without referring to the president directly, the Chief Justice nonetheless rebuked him, explaining that, quote, for more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement, and that, quote, the normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. Unfortunately, the MAGA extremists calling for impeachment of judges or the elimination of the courts don't care about this. The Constitution, centuries of judicial norms, the rule of law, they only care about one thing: fealty to Donald Trump. The baseless calls for Chief Judge Boasberg's impeachment confirm that. This is a judge who was a Yale Law School graduate, who cut his teeth as a successful homicide prosecutor, who was first appointed to the bench by a Republican president more than 20 years ago, who was confirmed to the federal bench in a 96-0 vote, and who was named by Chief Justice Roberts to a seat on the United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, where he served a 7-year term, including as the court's presiding judge. Yet, this is the judge, widely respected throughout the judiciary and legal profession, who President Trump calls a, quote, radical left lunatic, a troublemaker, and an agitator. That's Trump talking about Judge Boasberg, just because he ruled against the administration in a preliminary decision, which, by the way, a 3-judge panel of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals last week upheld on review. So while Trump's ad hominem attack on Judge Boasberg was typically baseless, it and other attacks like it leveled against other judges are no less dangerous. They have given rise to increased threats against judges, a, quote, significant uptick, as Chief Justice Roberts put in his report on the federal judiciary at the end of last year. Indeed, according to the Chief Justice, U.S. Marshals Service data showed a tripling of hostile threats and communications directed at judges over the preceding decade. Recently, judges have also experienced the swatting of their homes, the delivery of pizzas to their homes, actions intended to send the message, we know where you and your family live, where your children are. So reach the result which we want. Be afraid. Be very afraid. This is wrong. Very wrong. It is dangerous. It is intended to pressure judges in their decision-making. It puts lives at risk. It deserves the strongest possible across-the-board condemnation by all senators and all Americans. Instead, my Republican colleagues have been awfully quiet, fearful of upsetting President Trump, who has followed the Godfather Part 1 playbook and made them an offer they can't refuse. A primary opponent if they just don't go along. Well, finally, I have a few words about Donald Trump's unprecedented executive orders targeting law firms and individual lawyers who have litigated against him. These orders have suspended security clearances, canceled government contracts, barred employees from federal buildings, and erected other obstacles that prevent lawyers from representing their clients. Trump has even directed the Department of Justice to seek sanctions against attorneys who file frivolous lawsuits or engage in vexatious litigation against him. So with Donald Trump coming after lawyers and law firms, it's gut check time for law firms in our country, especially the big law firms that the president has targeted for revenge and retribution because of their lawyers daring to do their jobs and represented clients in cases against him. I commend those firms, like Wilma Hale, like Jenner and Block, who are standing up, who are fighting back. And we need all law firms to stand up to this administration and to continue to stand up for the rule of law. And those that don't, especially those that seek to appease and accommodate the president out of fear that their bottom line will suffer grave risk, grave harm to our liberties, will in fact depend upon the lawyers who take difficult and unpopular cases, often against the government, and zealously representing their clients in those matters. I'll conclude with this. The attacks on our judiciary, the calls for the impeachment of judges, and the attempts to intimidate and retaliate against lawyers who dare to stand in defense of the Constitution are not just an assault on individuals. They are an assault on the very foundations of our democracy. The courts are not pawns in a political game. The rule of law is not up to negotiation. If we allow this dangerous precedent to take root, if we tolerate threats against judges and lawyers who fulfill their constitutional duties, we set the stage for the erosion of the checks and balances that have safeguarded our nation for over 2 centuries. This is not about protecting one man. This is about protecting the principles that ensure justice and fairness for all Americans. It is time for all of us as a nation to rise above partisan interests and defend what makes us strong, our commitment to the Constitution, to the independence of the judiciary, and to the rule of law. And I urge my colleagues, all of my colleagues, and every American to stand in defending these sacred institutions, not for our political health, but for the health of our democracy itself. I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I'm here in support of Senator Kane's effort to get this body to take a public view on President Trump's mad declaration that we have a border emergency with Canada happening right now. I can tell you that if I go home to Rhode Island and ask people what the emergency is in their lives, I wouldn't get one person who said, oh, we've got a real emergency with Canada. They're a huge threat. That whole Canada situation, boy, that's dangerous. This is nutty stuff. And it's dangerous stuff economically. Just in Rhode Island, Canada is our largest international trading partner. 22% of Rhode Island's exports are to Canada. And we import from Canada as well. And when the tariffs get reciprocated by our Canadian friends after this ridiculous behavior by President Trump, then that's going to affect all Rhode Islanders. We buy a lot of energy, for instance, from Canada. And that's going to raise costs for Rhode Island families. It's a direct hit to people's pocketbooks. And as has been pointed out, this is just a shady way to hit Americans in the pocketbook, to raise revenue, so that this phony baloney budget resolution we're about to have to deal with can open up revenues that they can then use as a justification for lowering taxes for the billionaires and the big corporations who already pay way too little in taxes. Some billionaires pay no income taxes at all. The corporate share of America's revenue has gone from about 30% of America's revenue down to single digits. That's just a huge sucking sound pulling out of America's revenue, the revenue of corporate entities, and it's not the mom and pop flower store. It's the huge multinational that goes and pretends that it's doing its business in Ireland or the Cayman Islands or someplace and hides profits. This is a tax racket against the American people that is now being propped up and made worse by a tariff racket against the American people. And the excuse is one of the dumbest ones ever, that the emergency is fentanyl. Well, Rhode Island was at the heart of the opioid epidemic. That's why I worked with Senator Portman to pass the CARA bill, the biggest addiction recovery response bill this body has ever passed. I take this issue deadly seriously. Not the president. Not the president. 0.2% of the fentanyl in America comes across the enormous Canadian border. If you did it like per mile of the American border, it would be unmeasurably small. And over this fake excuse that there's a huge fentanyl problem, 0.2%, they're going to dump enormous new expenses on American families. People have called this a sales tax, and it kind of is, because what it does is it raises prices. It raises prices because the money that the federal government takes in has to be recovered, and it gets recovered from families, from people who are paying higher prices for imported goods or higher prices for the domestic freeloaders who are going to raise their prices to match the imported goods, just the way the fossil fuel industry raised their prices to match the foreign prices of fuel after the Ukraine invasion, and so gorged themselves that they made the biggest profits off the American people in the history of corporations. It was the biggest gouge ever by the scoundrels of the fossil fuel industry, and now we're opening the door for this to happen across all industries. American families are going to be hurt, and they're going to be hurt hard, and it just puts revenues on the books that the Republicans can then use to go and do what they really want to do here, which is to make sure that all their billionaire cronies, everybody who's surrounding Trump, all the pals in the cabinet, all the ones who write the big checks to the super PACs and who fund Republican politicians, that they don't have to pay taxes anymore. It's Leona Helmsley Day here in the Senate. Taxes are just for the little people. This is a disgrace, and I hope there'll be a few voices on the Republican side to recognize that considering the Canadian border to be an emergency is preposterous. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I rise to bring the attention of this body to a broken promise by our president. Our president promised in the campaign and recently in an address to all of us here in Congress to make America affordable again, to deal with the high prices of groceries, of fruits and vegetables, of housing supplies, of energy, to deal with high prices. Millions of Americans who voted for President Trump said they did so out of frustration about high prices. Well, today, President Trump has announced he is going to impose tariffs on virtually every trading partner we have. And I rise in support of a piece of legislation we're about to vote on here in the Senate that gives us a chance to do something. So to my colleagues, if you've heard as I have, from your constituents calling with concern and alarm about how much prices have not gone down but have gone up, I recommend you think about one country, one of our most trusted and loyal allies, some of the nicest people on the planet. Who doesn't like Canadians? Canadians have served alongside us in virtually every war we've ever fought. They are a NATO ally and partner. And for my small but mighty state of Delaware, our major export destination and the nation from which we import the most. And yet, because of an emergency at our border, which I think is wholly unjustified by the data of how little fentanyl actually comes into our country across the northern border, President Trump is moving ahead with slapping tariffs on Canada. Tonight you have a chance, I say to my colleagues, to vote to undo the declaration of an emergency on our northern border. You can vote to undo the harm to businesses, to small families, to retirement accounts. Don't look at your 401k. If you want to know tomorrow the consequences of indiscriminately slapping tariffs on every one of our major trading partners. This is not Liberation Day, but Tax Day, a new national sales tax that will harm the imports we buy from virtually every country, and because of the countervailing tariffs, harm our exports A tariff is a tax. And tonight we will take a vote, and I hope some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will join with Senator Kaine and many of us in recognizing it is ludicrous to use the special emergency powers that Congress gave to the president, assuming he would only do so in a case of war or active open hostility, not in the case of one of our trusted and loyal partners and allies, the great and kind people of Canada. In recent meetings with Canadian leaders, they've said, don't make us do it. Don't make us impose tariffs on you. But tonight, the Trump administration has imposed tariffs on dozens and dozens of our trading partners. To my friends and colleagues, let's vote to undo this phony crisis and vote to undo the tariffs on U.S.-Canada trade. Thank you.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak in opposition to the resolution. Senator Kaine and his fellow co-sponsors want a strong trade relationship with Canada. So do I. I consider, like President Reagan, Canadians to be not just friends and neighbors and allies, but kin, who together with us have built the most productive relationship between any two countries in the world today. By the way, I would note that the tariffs that President Trump announced today did not get applied to Canada. What we're talking about here today, however, in Senator Kaine's resolution, is not about our trading relationship. It is about the emergency stemming from fentanyl and illegal immigration. Senator Kaine and the other co-sponsors are challenging the how, meaning the means of what President Trump is doing, the threat of tariffs, through which President Trump addresses a national emergency. The Senate, however, is set up to vote on this proposal, however, today, on the why, whether an emergency exists. Under President Biden's watch, the number of people arrested on the northern border rose more than tenfold from 2022 to 2024. Indeed, publications like The Economist and the New York Times, documented here, showed extensively how the northern border has become increasingly insecure over the last year, with a massive spike in the number of migrant crossings. Just look at the spike on the chart. This is the New York Times reporting. And what do they say? Illegal migrant crossings skyrocketed 50-fold under the Biden-Harris administration at the northern border. That includes New York. Indeed, we have a crisis at the northern border. It is a fentanyl crisis and a migration crisis. In considering these figures, I want to emphasize, I don't blame Canada. I blame President Biden. President Biden repeatedly refused to prioritize border security. Indeed, when President Biden's nominee for the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection came through the Finance Committee, I asked him if he would at least admit that there was a border emergency, including on the southern border as well as the northern border. He, like President Biden himself, refused to take it seriously, with dire consequences for our communities in America. When President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau met last year, the Biden administration's top priorities included encouraging both countries to increase climate spending and advance diversity and inclusion. But when it came to common priorities that Americans actually wanted to see progress on, like combating illegal immigration, President Biden's view was that we should both, Canada and the United States, should both expand pathways to allow more migrants into the country and to promote Canada accepting 15,000 migrants. President Trump is right to change this trajectory, precisely because Canadians also are victims of illegal immigration and fentanyl. We must both prioritize these threats to our citizens. To sum it up, when my colleagues and I meet constituents who suffered at the hands of criminal elements which crossed illegally into the United States or from smuggled fentanyl, we do not consider them to be any more or less a victim depending on which border their harm illegally crossed. We say the most important thing is that this crisis must stop. Under President Trump, it is stopping. Accordingly, I encourage my colleagues to vote no on the resolution.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise for some concluding comments. I believe the vote will follow. I want to acknowledge my colleague from Idaho, his comments about the northern border. This is a bill that is fundamentally about tariffs. I acknowledge what my colleague said, that there are issues at the northern border, and I have colleagues who have shared that, and there's mechanisms for working out those issues. And I would ask my colleagues, if you're concerned about any issue on the northern border, do you think we will more likely to be able to deal with it if we work hand in hand with Canada, or do you think the path to success is punitive actions against Canada? I would argue plainly that the right way to deal with any issue at the border with Canada is to work with Canada, not wage a trade war against them. This vote, though, is fundamentally about tariffs. The President's imposition of tariffs against Canada that will be a costly tax increase on American families. If the President has concerns about trade issues with Canada, guess what? This President negotiated a signature trade deal, the USMCA, that got 89 bipartisan votes in this chamber, and he has a negotiating process to find a resolution to any issue he cares about. The imposition of tariffs does nothing more than put a tax on American families. What I'd like to do, I did speak earlier today, but what I'd like to do is just read quickly from many stakeholders who have weighed in support of Senate Joint Resolution 37. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, quote, "Tariffs are taxes paid by Americans, and they will quickly increase prices at a time when many are struggling with the cost of living. That's why it's appropriate for Congress to exercise its authority under EPA and pass Senate Joint Resolution 37. North American building trades, quote, the United States and Canada share far more than a border. We share a deep, enduring economic and workforce partnership that has strengthened both nations. That partnership is enshrined in the USMCA, a comprehensive trade agreement that President Trump himself negotiated. We shouldn't circumvent this agreement. Sheet metal workers. Tariff penalties aimed at Canada for non-trade objectives have already caused harsh and unnecessary economic pain for U.S. workers and harm to our nation's construction and related metal fabricating businesses. National Retail Federation. U.S. retailers depend on Canada for a wide range of consumer goods. These operations are all now being significantly disrupted because of the tariffs applied to Canada. U.S. Conference of Mayors, these actions are raising prices for consumers, disrupting key industries such as construction and manufacturing. They also risk increasing already high housing costs as lumber, steel, aluminum, and other critical building materials will make housing more expensive. The AFL-CIO, imposing large across-the-board tariffs on Canada aimed at non-trade objectives will only cause unnecessary economic pain for workers and businesses. The International Association of Machinists, these new tariffs on Canada, one of our closest allies, are unjust and will have a lasting negative impact on American and Canadian workers. The National Taxpayers Union, Canada is an important supplier of goods that strengthen U.S. security, including crude oil, natural gas, steel, aluminum. Tariffs that restrict our access to these supplies and increase their cost will weaken our industrial base. The Taxpayer Protection Alliance, TPA, enthusiastically supports the effort to overturn President Trump's February 1 national emergency declaration. This use of the IEEPA is fraught with issues. The ensuing trade war will inevitably raise costs for consumers. United Steelworkers, these new tariffs are misdirected, unsubstantiated by facts, and harmful to the very workers we represent. And finally, Advancing American Freedom, the think tank formed by former Vice President Mike Pence. Tariffs are attacks on American families and business. The first Trump administration cut an excellent deal with Canada, with the USMCA. The president should not abandon this agreement. We have a chance to stand strong for our businesses and consumers, our foresters and farmers, our national defense industry and shipbuilders against cost increases that will hurt people's pocketbooks, hurt American competitiveness, and hurt our national security. I urge my colleagues, vote yes on Senate Joint Resolution 37. I will yield back all time on the resolution.
All time is yielded back. Under the previous order, the clerk will read the title of the joint resolution a third time.
SJ Res 37, terminating the national emergency declared to impose duties on articles imported from Canada.
The question occurs on passage of the joint resolution. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be.
Ms.
The clerk
Also
will
Brooks.
call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice,
No.
Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Collins, Coons, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Murray, and Ossoff. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Capito, Cornyn, Kramer, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Graham, Grassley, Justice, Marino, Mullen, Rounds, Sheehy, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, and Tuberville.
Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Kim, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Ricketts, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester, aye.
Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Gallego, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Shipp, aye. Mrs. Britt, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Husted, no. Mr. Schmidt, no. Ms. McCormick, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Kennedy, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Rono, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mrs. Moody, no. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Budd, no.
All from
Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Yeah.
Mr. Fetterman, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Okay. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Banks, no. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Warner, aye.
Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Merkley, aye. Ms. Also Brooks, aye. Mr. Paul, aye.
Ms. Hassan, aye.
Okay. The yeas are 51. The nays are 48. The joint resolution's passed. The yeas are 51. The nays are 48. The joint resolution's passed.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that with respect to SJ Res 37, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Thursday, April 3rd, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate resume consideration of SJ Res 24, that all time be expired on the joint resolution at 11 a.m., and the Senate vote on passage of the joint resolution. Further, following disposition of the joint resolution, the Senate proceed to executive session and resume calendar number 46, and the Senate execute the order of April 2nd in relation to the Sauer nomination. And following disposition of the Sauer nomination, the Senate vote on the motion to invoke cloture on calendar number 53, amendment ayes. Further, notwithstanding Rule 22, it be in order for Senator Sanders to make two motions, discharge SJ Res 33 and SJ Res 26, and the Senate vote on the motions to discharge in the order listed if made at 2:30 p.m. Further, following disposition of the motion to discharge SJ Res 26, if cloture is invoked on the Oz nomination, the Senate vote on confirmation of the nomination, and following confirmation, the Senate execute the order of April 2nd in relation to the Dillon nomination. Finally, if any nominations are confirmed during Thursday's session, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the roll call vote on the motion to proceed to SJ Res 24.
Without
Res
objection.
24. I understand the Senate has received HJ Res 24 from the House.
The leader is correct.
I move to proceed to HJ Res 24.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to HJ Res 24, joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, and so forth.
Nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks. Ms. Baldwin.
Mullen, aye. Thank you. But aye.
I have you, sir. Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher,
Yes, thank you for doing that.
Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand,
Happy to help. Sorry you didn't get a win.
Torpedo bats.
Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Britt, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Husted, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Justice, Langford, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Tillis, Tuberville, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Cantwell, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, Kim, King, Klobuchar, Lujan, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schiff, Schumer, Shaheen, Slotkin, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Welch, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Thune, aye.
Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Curtis, aye.
The yeas are 51, the nays are 46. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report.
HJ Res 24, joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code and so forth.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.